Welcome back to McNulty's Book Corral. Today we're going to talk about Henry Miller. I've been wanting to do an episode about Henry Miller for some time, and I thought, well, I'll take a crack at it today. We'll see how it goes. We'll see if I stumble over my sentences and my words and my adjectives and so forth and so on, and see if I can blurb something out, and hopefully it'll make a little bit of sense. Henry Miller, when you talk about Henry Miller, who was born in 1891 and died in 1980, most people think about the big S word, S-E-X. I don't think of him that way, although that is what made him notorious for the bulk of his career. His books really didn't get published in the United States until the early 1960s. They were banned because of his explicit, blunt talk about S-E-X and so forth. And, you know, he was the type of writer who... he was fearless. He didn't understand and care about boundaries at all. He moved beyond boundaries. He was, as I mentioned in a previous episode, he was deeply influenced by such books as Hunger by Knut Hamsun, Steppenwolf by Hermann Hesse, and Down and Out in Paris and London by George Orwell, which I covered those three books in another episode, a previous episode. He was also influenced by Celine's Journey to the End of the Night and so forth and so on. So anyways, the very first book of his that I read is generally the one that most people first read, which is Tropic of Cancer, which is really a great book. It does have some blunt sexual discussions in it. I don't consider this to be pornographic at all. I don't think it's that explicit, although I guess it is there. But the issue here is that he spoke explicitly at a time when it wasn't fashionable. D.H. Lawrence, of course, had done it with Lady Chatterley's Lover, and there were others as well. But this book is notable for other reasons, because this is Paris pre-war, Paris before World War II, the Paris of Hemingway, and so forth, and Ezra Pound and all of those people who were there. And Henry Miller describes that hedonistic lifestyle brilliantly, and it's an amazing book to read. It reads like autobiography. It's really fictionalized, but not all of it is fictionalized. There is snippets of autobiography here, and it's a remarkable book to read if you haven't read it. So this is where you begin if you haven't read Henry Miller. If you can get through this, it's really kind of amazing, because at the end he feels the war's coming. He knows it's going to happen, and this lifestyle is going to vanish from the world forever. Not quite really, but that was the general impression. It's a remarkable book. He followed Tropic of Cancer with Tropic of Capricorn, which is about New York, his life in New York, which is equally as memorable as his life in Paris in the 30s. So this would have been kind of a prequel to it. And this book is on par with anything he wrote. Some people consider Tropic of Capricorn his best book. He did another trilogy. He kept returning to his life in New York prior to going to Paris. And he did the Rosy Crucifixion, which was in Sexus, Nexus, and Plexus. I have those somewhere in a box in the paperbacks. Henry Miller was great. So that would be the second book. I read them in this order. Then we got to Black Spring, which is a collection of shorter pieces, which was published in the early 60s. And this is a marvelous book, too. This has a very famous story in here called The Angel is My Watermark. He created watercolors and so forth. Henry Miller was quite a creative powerhouse. Fun to read. He's a social commentator. He's a philosopher. He's a hedonist. He is a compassionate man. And my three of my favorite books by Henry Miller these are later books that he did, and these people don't talk about these very much. The Air Conditioned Nightmare, which is 1945, I believe he did this, which is a travel memoir. I'm going to read you a little passage from here real quick, just to give you the flavor of Henry Miller's writing. So Henry Miller's air-conditioned nightmare. At Gettysburg, at Bull Run, at Manassas, at Fredericksburg, at Spotsylvania Courthouse, at Missionary Ridge, at Vicksburg, I tried to visualize the terrible death struggle in which this great republic was locked for 4 long years. I have stood on many battlefields in various parts of the world, but when I stand beside the graves of the dead in our own South, the horror of war assails me with desolating poignancy. I see no results of this great conflict which justify the tremendous sacrifice which we as a nation were called upon to make. I see only an enormous waste of life and property, the vindication of right by might, and the substitution of one form of injustice for another. The South is still an open, gaping wound. The new Atlanta, sprung from the ashes of the old, is a hideous, nondescript city combining the evil, ugly traits of both North and South. The new Richmond is lifeless and characterless. New Orleans lives only in its tiny French quarter, and even that is being rapidly demolished. Charleston is a beautiful memory, a corpse whose lower limbs have been resuscitated. Savannah is a living tomb about which there still clings a sensual aura as in old Corinth. Amidst these embers of the past, the Southerner treads his defiant way. Compared to the man of the North, he is a charming, gracious, courteous, dignified, civilized being. He is sensitive and touchy, also capable of violent explosions, which to a Northerner are most unpredictable. Henry Miller, when I think of Henry Miller, I think the best word that describes Henry Miller is perception. He was one of those who looked at the world and he saw it exactly the way it is. And he wrote about it exactly the way it is. And he didn't censor himself. He got right to it. Air-Conditioned Nightmare. Very interesting travel memoir. Unlike any travel memoir you will ever read anywhere else. So another one is Big Sur and the Oranges of Hieronymus Bosch by Henry Miller. Here is another great book by him. Another one, which is a triptych. Okay, so here's a little passage. I want to read this. Different type of passage. I picked 3 passages to read, well, actually 4, that are a little different. There are 2 magic hours of the day which I have only really come to know and wait for, bathe in, I might say, since living here. One is dawn, the other sunset. In both we have what I like to think of as the true light, the one cold, the other warm, but both creating an ambiance of super reality, or the reality behind reality. At dawn, I look out to sea where the far horizon is painted with bands of rainbow tints, and then at the hills that range the coast, ever entranced by the way the reflected light of dawn licks and warms the backs of the drugged rhinoceros. If there is a ship in sight, the sun's bent rays give it a gleam and sparkle which is utterly dazzling. One can't tell immediately that it is a ship. It seems more like the play of northern lights. Towards sundown, when the hills in back of us are flushed with that other true light, the trees and scrub in the canyons take on a wholly different aspect. Everything is brush and cones, umbrellas of light, the leaves, the boughs, stalks, trunks, standing out separate and defined, as if etched by the Creator himself. It is then one notices rivers of trees catapulting down the slopes, or are they columns of soldiers, hoplites storming the walls of the canyon? At any rate, at this hour, one experiences an incredible thrill in observing the spatial depths between the trees, between the limbs, boughs, and branches, between the leaves. It is no longer earth and air, but light and form, heavenly light, celestial form. When this intoxicating reality reaches its height, the rocks speak out. They assume more eloquent shapes and forms than the fossils of prehistoric monsters. They clothe themselves in vibrant colored raiment, glittering with metallic residues, and on and on. Henry Miller talking about Big Sur, where he lived at the end of his life for quite a few decades. Henry Miller and the Oranges of Hieronymus Bosch is a remarkable work of art. And finally, well, we have two more to do. Another travel memoir, The Colossus of Marusi, by Henry Miller. And I think this is a shorter one. Let's see what I picked here when I was going back and looking these over. Yeah, here it is. Listen to this. Listen to him talking about Greece and Greeks. In Greece, one has the conviction that genius is the norm, not mediocrity. No country has produced, in proportion to its numbers, as many geniuses as Greece. In 1 century alone, this tiny nation gave to the world almost 500 men of genius. Her art, which goes back 50 centuries, is eternal and incomparable. The landscape remains the most satisfactory, the most wondrous that our earth has to offer. The inhabitants of this little world lived in harmony with their natural surroundings, peopling them with gods who were real and with whom they lived in intimate communion. The Greek cosmos is the most eloquent illustration of the unity of thought and deed. It persists even today, though its elements have long since been dispersed. The image of Greece, faded though it may be, endures as an archetype of the miracle wrought by the human spirit. A whole people, as the relics of their achievements testify, lifted themselves to a point never before and never since attained. It was miraculous. It still is. The task of genius, and man is nothing if not genius, is to keep the miracle alive, to live always in the miracle, to make the miracle more and more miraculous, to swear allegiance to nothing, but live only miraculously, think only miraculously, die miraculously. That gives you a little taste of Henry Miller's philosophy of living. Quite remarkable, quite ahead of his time, quite a brilliant statement for this man to make, a man whose books were banned for many, many years, a man who lived the way that he chose to live rather than the way society wanted him to live. Remarkable writer, remarkable creative mind. Finally, after his death, they published some of his manuscripts posthumously. Most of them weren't very good. There's one called Opus Pistorum, which is just pornography and so forth and so on. But Moloch, or This Gentile World, is an interesting book. It wasn't published, like I said, till after his death. And it has a couple of interesting passages. You get the full Miller here, too. And this is one that I'm glad they published, because you get these wonderful, flowing, spontaneous passages that he wrote out. So, again, I think in this one he's talking about New York. So this is one of his first drafts at writing about his experiences in New York. And here's a little bit that he wrote. Third person. Meanwhile, his senses were jangled by a weird cacophony. Boss Tweed's progeny of thugs and werewolves choked the Bowery's grim gullet like clots of phlegm. Dick Croker's penny arcade of lice, lungers, lifers, and hallucinations was at noon of this day in the third decade of the 20th century a maelstrom of frenetic rhythms. Cranes swinging, bells ringing, horns blowing, gongs clanging, gears meshing and scraping. Crazy, jagged rhythms like the marriage of the brown derby and the slide trombone. The world of the machine in a tempo of glorified planetary abandon, an orgasm of inorganic lust, rising to a crescendo of atomic disintegration. A weird, unearthly chant of a Bowery that had severed its affinity with Dick Croker's dime museum of rot gut and syphilis, a veritable dirge dedicated by labor to capital on the ashes of Rosie O'Grady. An amalgamated union of groans supplied by the international workers of the world, death rattles contributed gratis by the Salvation Army, Visions of Chuck Connors with a cleaver fighting his way through delirium tremens. Shadows of comets swishing through rhomboidal space in Buxtehude. Henry Miller, spontaneous prose. When the rabble of the sidewalk observed this farrago which took possession of Moloch's soul was a modest, sensitive individual of medium height, with the composite features of scholar and faun, wearing a shirt of pale dungaree beneath a suit of Bedford whipcord. The composite features of scholar and faun. What a beautiful line that is. Henry Miller writing about his early days in New York in the early part of the last century. So today I wanted to promote, for you who have not read Henry Miller or been introduced to him, forget what the critics and the scholars are saying. They always talk about the sex and his hedonistic lifestyle. There's a lot of social commentary, a lot of social criticism. There is an independent religiosity involved in this, great philosophical musings on art and nature and the nature of man and their relationship to the creation of art and the world at large and how to live properly. Henry Miller is a lot more than one type of writer. Remarkable achievement. So I wanted to get that out there. I wanted to revisit Henry Miller. I haven't done that myself in a long time, so I went back and looked at these books and started rereading again to prepare for this. And I was equally as delighted as when I first read Henry Miller all of those long decades ago. He still holds up well. And you can look up Henry Miller and more about him on your own. I just wanted to get that out there for this episode. And so, a quick housekeeping note. There are going to be very fewer episodes this summer. I might have 2 a month. We'll see how it goes. So this is being scheduled in advance because I'll be on the road. And until then, I'll be here, but scattershot, buckshot approach. Stay well, stay happy, feed your brain. Read a book.